Elliot Cross didn't believe in monsters. Not until his brother died at the hands of something unnatural. 4 years later, a string of impossible deaths leave the police baffled. A student burnt to death with no flames. A gunshot with no bullet. There's a supernatural killer on the loose. Could this be Elliot's chance to make a difference? MIME, the debut novel from Chrissy Harrison. Available now.
Hello! This is my first ever live stream, so welcome. I think I've got 4 people still tuned in, so that's cool. I was very much expecting that I was going to start this and there wouldn't be anybody here, but you know, so hi, hello. If you want to pop a comment in the comments and let me know who's here, that would be awesome. This is my book launch day. I am launching my first ever book. This is mine. This is my copy with my little tippies in for my readings. And yeah, so I picked these up last week, and we've been sort of waiting the last sort of week or so for the day. This is the day. This is so. Although it's been sort of partially available in certain places before now, this is the official day that it is now officially released. So yay! This live stream that I'm doing today is just a little bit of a chance for me to just have a bit of fun and share a couple of readings from the book and answer any questions that you might have, or you know, just share the coolness. So yes, where should we start? Okay, so first things first, I am running a giveaway for a signed copy. So if you do or don't have a copy, or you know somebody who might want a present or something that you could give them, then why not enter the giveaway? I will post the link to the giveaway in the comments. Give me 2 seconds while I do that. Okay. There we go, that is the giveaway link. I will just quickly say that there is about a 10-second lag between what I'm doing here and when it appears on Facebook. So if it's taking a while for me to reply to anything on that you've posted in the chat, then that's why. Yeah, that's all good. So right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to stream a pre-recorded reading of chapter 1, which is something I did for the Kickstarter a while back, but which hasn't been available sort of more widely until now. So I'm going to put that on in a minute, and that's about 10 minutes or so, and whilst that's playing, that gives you a chance to have a think about any questions you might want to ask and to pop those in the chat, and then we can have a little chat afterwards. So yeah, if you want to pop your questions in the chat, and I will see you in about 10 minutes.
Oily and bitter, the lingering odour of burnt flesh lodged in the back of Elliot's throat. If he hadn't known where the smell came from, he might not have thought anything of it. 15 minutes had passed since the first reports had hit social media. 10 minutes since spontaneous combustion had started trending and flagged up on Elliot's searches. Mostly third-hand accounts, but he'd found enough supposed eyewitnesses to convince him it was worth investigating. 7 minutes since he'd left the Weird News office to drive down White Ladies Road and across the city centre to the scene. Now, as he approached the waterside edge of Castle Park, that hint of charred human on the breeze made the whole situation more real. He pressed his lips together, swallowed, and headed closer. A couple of patrol cars were parked on the roadside, alongside a grey Ford Mondeo he suspected was an unmarked police vehicle from the radio equipment visible on the dashboard. Rows of curious people gathered behind railings strung with blue and white striped tape. Some held phones above their heads like digital periscopes, trying to glimpse the focus of all the activity before the daylight faded. People loved a morbid circus. Elliot pushed closer to the front. Beyond the cordon, blue lights flashed from the roof of a police car parked near the bandstand. No sirens, though, which left the park oddly quiet against the background hum of the city. Further in, another police car, 2 ambulances and a white van were parked in a rough circle around a brightly lit white tent, which presumably had hid the remains. A large presence, but then Bristol had been on high alert for violent crime since the shooting last week. He'd missed the initial frantic activity. Now quiet tension held sway. At a break in the railings, where a cycle path entered the park, the police tape looped between several bollards. There, a police officer wearing a stab vest stood with his hands clasped in front of him, chin tilted up as if daring anyone to try something. Elliot sized the man up from a distance. In his 40s, maybe even early 50s, and stuck with guard duty. Couldn't be an ambitious sort, but probably dependable, stoic. The onlookers were certainly giving him a wide berth. Elliot doubted he'd get more from him than an official line, but if he could get the man flustered, something might slip. He extracted himself from the press of bodies and skirted the rear of the crowd. The constable gave him the evil eye as he approached. Should have known you'd turn up at some point. Elliot tried for a friendly but professional smile. Have we met? No, but the inspector warned me about you. Detective Inspector Yates? The man nodded. Now Elliot remembered where he'd seen that particular grey Mondeo before. He could do without crossing paths with Yates again, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. It had been weeks since a story with genuine supernatural potential had broken so close. Well, PC... He looked for a name tag. Reynolds. Right, Elliot Cross. He held out a hand, which Reynolds briefly shook. I'm sure he'll have told you I'm just a reporter, right? Reynolds' jaw twitched. That wasn't the word he used, he muttered. Elliot kept his expression bland, pretending he hadn't heard. I'm only after the facts. Is there a theory on how the fire started? Reynolds widened his stance and straightened up. You've wasted a trip, I'm afraid. We're not releasing any details at this time. I appreciate your investigation has barely begun, but surely there's a basic statement you can give me. The man folded his arms. D.I. Yates will be issuing a press statement tomorrow morning. You'll have to wait till then. Right. But you see, there's already a lot of speculation flying around. Maybe you could help me put a few rumours to bed before things get out of hand? He took his notebook from his pocket, flipped to a fresh page. Reynolds frowned and said nothing. Are you treating this as an act of violence, an attack? I can't disclose that information, Reynolds said, but at the same time he shook his head. All right. Is there any truth to reports of the man getting angry before the incident? Any evidence he was making a phone call? Reynolds shifted his feet. What's that got to do with anything? What about unusual phenomenon in the lead-up? Strange silences, animals acting unpredictably. Unusual? A man died from burns. There's nothing unusual about it. Have a little respect. I apologise. I meant no disrespect. I'm sure there's a clear, rational explanation for what happened. Of course. Which is? He held Reynolds' gaze, letting him see a hint of a challenge. You'll have to wait till the press statement. Fair enough. Elliot made a show of jotting a few notes. Reynolds huffed. Are you done? Did the victim work with flammable chemicals at all? Not that we know of. Now, I'm serious. You'll have to wait till tomorrow. Move along. I understand. Thank you for your time. Elliot finished noting down his thoughts as he returned to the crowd. The number of people didn't seem to be decreasing. Why were they here, really? He could still taste that bitter taint on the back of his tongue. Had any of them even noticed it? Of course, some of that bitterness might have come from realising how much his reputation had spread among the Avon and Somerset constabulary. Police withholding information was to be expected, but Reynolds' unsettled demeanour suggested that whatever had happened wasn't clear-cut. Otherwise they'd have wrapped up faster and at least issued a basic statement to forestall any hysterics. He was certain they didn't have a theory, but that didn't mean much. As a rule, he didn't accept a lack of evidence as proof, especially when it came to the supernatural. For all that Weird News drew a fairly sensationalist readership, it was a matter of principle that he stuck to the same journalistic standards he always had. What he needed now was first-hand witness. He backtracked along the cordon. About 50 yards from the cycle path, the road dropped below the level of the park. It turned 90 degrees to the right along the base of a 4-foot retaining wall, topped by dense shrubs. There was, technically, no access into the park this way, and no police guarded it. With the daylight fading quickly, it should be easy to stay hidden. Elliot checked no one was looking, then hoisted himself onto the wall. He scrambled through the overgrown bushes, picking up a few scrapes and almost losing his glasses when a stray branch flicked in his face. He crouched behind the fence at the top of the slope and paused, giving any details a chance to leap out at him from this new vantage point. 3 shadows moved around inside the tent, silhouetted against the canvas by work lights running off a portable generator, still gathering evidence. The rear doors of one ambulance stood open. Inside, a paramedic moved around a person sitting on the stretcher. Elliot could only see the edge of a knee and arm, but anyone being treated must have been involved. He checked Reynolds was still facing the other way, then climbed over the fence. As he approached, it became clear the patient was a young woman. The harsh fluorescent lights washed the colour out of her pale complexion, and greasy soot stained her blonde hair. The paramedic was applying dressings to her hands. Behind the ambulance, the central tent stirred as those inside emerged. Elliot darted round to the far side of the vehicle, out of sight. "But they're not looking in the right place," the girl was saying. "I wouldn't worry," the paramedic said. "The police will go over every inch of the park if they have to. If it's important, they'll find it." "But they won't. Everyone's walked all over it now. You can't even see where it was." She sighed, then sucked in a pained breath through her teeth. "Sorry, nearly there." Elliot leaned against the side of the vehicle, listening to see if she'd elaborate further before he put his head in to introduce himself. "All done," the paramedic said. "We'll get you up to the hospital as soon as we can. I'll be back in just a tick." She stepped down from the ambulance and Elliot waited until she'd moved away, and inside, the girl with the burned hand sniffed like she was crying. He was about to step round to talk to her when a hand settled on his shoulder and squeezed tight enough to make him wince. You'd better have a damn good explanation why you're on this side of the tape," a deep voice said near his ear. The hand on his shoulder pulled him round, and he stood face to face with a man he unfortunately recognised. "Detective Yates. I hoped I might." Cross. What a surprise. A sneer pulled at the detective's mouth, replaced quickly by a rigid scowl which deepened lines that clearly saw a lot of use. Elliot had started off on the wrong foot with Yates not long after he moved to Bristol. He'd published a piece debunking one of the detective cases while it was still going through court. While his article hadn't affected the proceedings, the scandal had escalated in ways he hadn't anticipated. Talk of positive discrimination and questions about whether Yates had been promoted on merit or whether the colour of his skin helped someone, somewhere, to meet a target. And that wasn't the only time they'd clashed. Yates stepped closer, invading Elliot's personal space to the point where Elliot could smell the mint of his gum tainted with tobacco. "Always got to push your luck, don't you? Poking your nose in where you shouldn't." The frustration radiating off the detective couldn't only be about him. Nosy reporters were a fact of police life, and although Yates made no effort to hide his distaste for the press in general, he was usually more subtle. No, this was because what lay in that white tent defied explanation. "No nose poking," Elliot said, retreating several steps and raising his hands in placation. "Just after the facts." Yates frowned. "Facts are my business." The detective glanced at the ambulance. "I hope you weren't planning on approaching a vulnerable witness." Yates fought to keep his expression neutral and his mouth shut. "Come on, piss off. This is a crime scene, for Christ's sake." Yates gestured towards the barrier tape and Reynolds, who was watching them in the fading twilight. The constable reached for the radio clip to his vest. Elliot turned to face Yates. Over the detective's shoulder he could see the girl sitting in the ambulance. She briefly made eye contact. Then Yates stepped closer, blocking the view. Elliot refocused on the detective. "So this is being treated as a crime?" Yates blinked, then scowled. "What did I say about pushing your luck? Leave, now, or I will physically escort you out of the park." When Elliot hesitated, the detective made to grasp his arm. Elliot jerked out of reach. "All right, I'm going." With one last frustrated look towards the ambulance, he started walking. "Freak," Yates muttered behind his back. He swallowed the jab and kept moving. There was nothing more he could do here anyway. The girl would be the key. Somehow he'd have to identify her and find her again.
Hello, and we're back. Cool, so I hope you enjoyed that. That was the pre-recorded chapter 1 that I did for the Kickstarter a few weeks ago. So that being chapter 1. I'm going to do a couple more readings in a little while. I'm going to do a little excerpt from chapter 5 and one from chapter 7. So we will do those in a bit. In the meantime, though, let's do some questions. So Chloe popped a question in the chat for me, which was very cool. Thank you, Chloe. And also hi to everybody else. I'll just do the quick shout out, shall I? Let's do hello to Chloe and Rich and Steve and Stephen and Pete and family, my wonderful brother-in-law and family, and to Margaret and Sheila. Thank you for tuning in, you guys. And to who else is here? I'm scrolling down, and Ruth. Lovely to have you here. Thank you for tuning in. Right, so let's do some questions. I've got a couple that I have poached from somewhere else, but we will start with Chloe, since that was the one that got posted in the chat. If anybody else has some questions they want to put in the chat, then, you know, let's have a bit of fun with it. You can ask about the book, you can ask about writing, you can ask about anything you can see in my chaotic office behind me, like what is this weird chart thingy over here, and whatever. Just go for it, whatever you want to put. So Chloe asks, real world locations versus imaginary locations, which do I find easier to write? That's a brilliant question, because they're actually both really hard in completely different ways. I find if I'm writing an imaginary location, I struggle with creating enough detail and enough specificity to make it feel real and to make it feel complete and vivid. When I'm writing a real world location, I struggle more with accuracy and working out what parts of the real place to include and what, in order to be succinct and straightforward with it. So yeah, both of them have their challenges. I think the thing I like about writing real world locations is that there's always the opportunity to go there. Field trips are my secret weapon. So when I was writing MIME, quite early on, well, we're early-ish on, when would this have been? About 2015, I think it was. So a few years back now, but early-ish in the sort of proper serious drafting phase. I actually took my first trip to Oxford to do some research there, and there was I think what I discovered by doing that was how inaccurate my sort of online research had been. So I'd done a lot of like looking on Google Maps and reading about the city and looking at photographs, but none of them really conveyed the sense of being there. So mainly the tourists. There's a lot of tourists in Oxford, and really you wouldn't sort of have an accurate portrayal of Oxford unless it was full of tourists and the characters were having to dodge their way around lots of people aimlessly looking up at the pretty architecture. So I think that was a real sort of like developmental moment for me as a writer, was to understand when I'm trying to write a place that being there and experiencing it gives me a better insight into what I want to put to convey that place. Another really good example, there's a location later on in the book on Dartmoor, which I initially wrote based on sort of like tracing it through tracing the route on an Ordnance Survey map, and through looking at photos on Google Maps and so on and so forth. But again, when I went there, the sheer scale and impassability of some of the areas sort of became a lot more clear. So it was like, okay, that's not going to work. I can't have them walking through this wood because nobody can walk through this wood because it's just full of boulders. So so things like that, I think, for real world locations, if you can't go there, you have to sort of hope that your research has been up to the task. And so on, but and then with imaginary locations, I think when I'm sort of writing, if I'm writing something that's purely imaginary, like a fantasy setting or something like that, then it's almost easier because everything is of the same sort of needs to be created, and you know that you have to sort of create everything. Whereas when you're trying to create sort of fictional places but within the real world, then you have to sort of then also integrate them as well. So you're trying to sort of like describe something in the same way as you might describe a real place, so that it sort of seamlessly fits in, and that's quite a challenge in its own right. So yeah, I think I would say on the whole, if I can go to a place and I can stand in it and I can take photographs and I can draw sketches and I can feel what it's like to be in the space, that is the easiest starting point for describing that location for me. And then sort of probably a fully imaginary world would probably be the next easiest option, and then trying to combine different things together from real world locations you can't go to and imaginary locations you're trying to fit into a real world setting, that would probably be my most difficult sort of option, which is basically what I write, so yay. I think that sort of covers that one. Let's move on. Let's see, let me just have a quickie chat, look on the thing. If anybody's got any more questions, there's still time to add those to the chat. So I'm going to quickly do I'm just going to very quickly check to see if anyone's posted anything on Twitter, which they have not, so that's okay. And okay, so I have a couple of questions here which I pinched from a sort of author interview list that I found online, which is the very sort of straightforward, what are you currently working on? So what am I currently working on? Well, in terms of MIME and the weird new series, because it is going to be a series, I am currently working on a sequel, which at the moment I'm calling Hunters, and that probably will stick as the title. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it will. Which is set about 4 months after the end of MIME, and sort of continues the story with Sam and Elliot. I'm also working on a prequel novella. Why? I don't know. It was partially because I wanted to be able to offer a sort of a different alternate starting point for readers to engage with the series, and I wanted it to be something shorter, so it wasn't a full-on novel, and I could do it as a sort of like a giveaway for my subscribers and so on and so forth. So that's going to be a shorter piece, and that's actually kind of like a bit of backstory for Elliot prior to MIME, and that one covers a little bit about where the idea for starting a supernatural publication came from. So that'll be quite good fun. I'm looking forward to finishing that one. And I'm also working on a few short stories. Those of you who got involved with the Kickstarter, you will know that there is 2 short stories on the way for you. One of which is the Lee Woods Wisp. Any Bristol natives will know Lee Woods, so I'm doing a sort of a little short story adventure just to give it kind of gives an idea of what it is that Elliot and Sam do on a normal day. What's a normal day at the office when you're a paranormal investigator, sort of thing. So, and then also Date Night, or Date Night Jitters as it now is, which is like a little follow-on short story that is just kind of like a slice, what they call a slice of life story, in that it doesn't really, it's very much character driven, so it's just a little vignette about the characters and about their relationship and so on, and it doesn't really fit into the same genre as the series itself. It's just a little sort of add-on piece that people can read if they want to sort of like, you know, just follow that sort of story about Elliot and Sam a little bit further. And yeah, what do I have then in store beyond that? Well, I've got another short, which will probably be sort of like, well, it won't quite be novella length, but it'll be a longer short story, which is just a fun little exploration of Elliot's sort of life post-MIME, learning new skills and so on, and involves a possessed doll and a lot of cursing. Cursing as in expletives rather than cursing, although other kind of cursing too, actually. So yes, anyway, that's coming along. And then after that, we've got more novels in store. I've got one more that I know will be coming after Hunters, which will be returning to another character that features in MIME, who is Liam. He appears in the book quite a lot in MIME, but he doesn't feature in Hunters, so he'll be coming back for book 3, so that'll be fun. And then beyond that, I'm not 100% sure. I have ideas, but none of them are sort of like fully structured, or I don't quite know how they're going to be sequenced yet. So we'll get to those when we get to them. Right, okay, so that's that one. What else have we got? Okay, let's see. So Steve asks, what made you decide to use Matador to print, and how did their editing process? How did their editing process of your manuscript go? Right. Okay. So my decision to go with Matador, I encountered them for the first time back in around about 2015 when I went to the London Book Fair for the first time, and following that, I then went to the self-publishing conference in Leicester, which is a yearly self-publishing event, which is, I highly recommend it if you're considering self-publishing of any kind. It's just a really good event. It's really good value for money. Possibly not this year because it's in Leicester, but it's a really good event for learning how the publishing industry works and how you as a self-publisher can fit into that. So they run a sort of a full day event, and it has seminars and talks and so on. And I've learned things there, like I learned about public lending rights. So if you're a published author and your books are in libraries, how there is a sort of like a pot of money that gets distributed among authors to help sort of reimburse them, remunerate them for having their books available in libraries. So that's kind of cool. I learned a lot about cover design and about how the book trade works for getting your books into bookshops. So things like that, just from going along to this thing, going and attending the seminars there, have been really good. They also usually have really good keynote speakers as well. They had Orna Ross, who's the head of the Alliance of Independent Authors there last year, and I think the year before they had one of the higher up VPs of Nielsen Book Data. So that was very cool. So that was sort of how I became aware of Matador. And I sort of learned sort of more about their process, I think, over, sort of researched more into it. And one of the reasons I decided to go that way, because it is very expensive, there is a lot of costs involved, but it is the closest thing you can get to traditionally publishing whilst not having to give up any control over your book. And for me, for Weird News and for this series, that was quite important, because because Weird News and the series plugs into a sort of a wider universe with the sort of the Gabriel Cushing films that I helped make and so on. I didn't want to sort of like be giving up the rights to a third party, and I didn't necessarily want to be. I wanted to be able to control the timeline more myself. So that was sort of where that decision to self-publish came from. And then to go with Matador, it was partially because I knew the book was going to be quite long, and so I knew I was going to have to go print run rather than print on demand. Print on demand for a book that size, you can't then resell it without charging sort of 15 quid for it. So the print run option gets the costs down. So that was, and then Matador also have then a distribution chain, so they can they automatically plug into the wider book distribution network. So I have a whole bunch of boxes sitting in my living room, but I also have a whole bunch of boxes sitting in Matador's warehouse, where they supply their distributor, and they supply their distributor then supplies Amazon and Waterstones and W. Smiths and Gardner's, not Bertram's anymore, unfortunately, but and of course then Gardner's then supplies most of the indie bookshops now. So there's a mechanism for it to get out there. Now, whether or not that is important for me as a first time indie author is debatable, but it was something I made that decision to do that based on various different things. Other people will make a different decision, and so on. So that was sort of my decision to go with it, was really to get that sense of, I wanted to access the features of traditional publishing without having to give up that control. So I still wanted to self-publish, but I wanted to be able to access as many of the features of traditional publishing as I could, and this was the way that I identified. Ultimately, when I went through the process, it wasn't 100% as streamlined and as smooth as I wanted it to be, but we did work through some of the hiccups and got there in the end, so that was good. The editing process, which was the other part of Steve's question, that was actually probably the best part of it. My editing process in total actually started before I actually submitted to Matador, but because I actually I sent my book out to a bunch of beta readers, and I got some feedback from them on the story and the characters and the narrative and so on, which I then did another pass edit, another self-edit based on that feedback. And then after that, I then worked with Jo Hall, from who's sort of affiliated with Grimbold Books, and she sort of is I consider her to be my editor. She's the one who went through and did my line edit, my where is it bad and where is it good and what do I need to do to make it better and so on. So she was the one who helped me sort of improve the quality of the prose and lift that up. And then what Matador offer as an editing option is what they call a corrective copy edit. So a lot of independent publishers, indie authors now, when they engage an editor, it'll be either for a kind of like a combined line and copy edit together. So because the two things sort of like do two different jobs, but a lot of people sort of now tackle the same thing with one pass. So but what Matador do is they don't sort of pass judgment on the quality of the prose. They just make sure it's grammatically correct and all of the spelling is there and the punctuation is correct and so on and so forth. So they fix the errors, they don't improve the quality. But that was one of the reasons why I worked with Jo to do a pass before I even got to Matador. So that for me worked really well because it gave me the option to do bigger changes off the back of Jo's feedback and suggestions and edits. And then when it got to Matador, it was already in the position where I was happy with the story and I was happy with the scenes, and I just wanted them to make sure that it was correct. So that was good. We went through that process, and that process was fantastic. I don't know who my copy editor was, but they were brilliant. They did a really good job. And after that, it then got typeset. And then we needed to have it proofread. Unfortunately, as I said, there was a few hiccups with Matador. One of those hiccups was the fact that there was a bit of confusion over some of the quotes and the billing at the beginning. So I actually was a little bit over budget by this point. So I didn't take up their proofreading quote. I found my own proofreader. So I went with another person. So actually, there's been 3 different pairs of eyes, all not associated with each other, who've all been over this book. So I imagine that if the quality of their proofreading process is the same as the quality of their copy editing process, then it would be very good. And as I said, they were timely and very their attention to detail was very good. So yeah. I think that covers the whole of Steve's question. So I shall now move on to I've got Mark here saying, who are your biggest literary influences? Ooh, that's a difficult one. I don't know. It's a hard question to answer because I consider myself to be quite a slow reader. I love books and I love reading, but I do not chew through hundreds of books every year. That is just not something I'm capable of doing. I would have to be reading every day for about 4 or 5 hours in order to do that. So I have my favourite authors. I like to sort of like try new authors all the time. But there's an awful lot that I haven't read, which is probably a bad thing to admit as an author. But I mean, I do read. I read a lot, but I don't read maybe as much as I could or should. But in terms of influences, I did a blog post about this a while back, and so I gave it a bit of thought. And one of the first ones I said was James Herbert. So I was a James Herbert reader, not a Stephen King reader. I've never actually read any Stephen King, so which is kind of funny because people are kind of comparing the MIME to Pennywise already, so that's fun. But I've never actually read any Stephen King, but I have read quite a bit of James Herbert, particularly his early books. I sort of thought, I reckon I probably have there's a bit of an influence there in some of the ways that I describe things and some of the ways that I structure my scenes a little bit. And also maybe the qualities of some of my hero characters as well, I think possibly were maybe influenced by some of his sort of hero characters. Is very much the sort of everyman kind of character who is no sort of big hero. He isn't sort of like a military person or a police officer or anything like that. They're just, a school teacher or pest control person or something like that, and so that I think was possibly, that's probably fed into my sort of the way that I choose my characters, my heroes. It's probably something comes a little bit from that. Also Kelly Armstrong. Kelly Armstrong was the author that I was reading around about the time I decided I wanted to do this as a career. So I joined the Kelly Armstrong writing group on her fan forum around about the time that I first started. Well, I started sort of like trying to write a novel. That's going to be easy. Yeah, no, not so much. So around about the time I started putting pen to paper on MIME and trying to figure out how on earth this whole novel writing process worked, I realised sort of very quickly that I had a lot to learn. And one of the places I turned to for advice was the Kelly Armstrong fan forum, where they had a writers group, and they had a lot of sort of more experienced writers than me there. Some of them have gone on to be very successful authors in their own right, so very cool. But yeah, so at the time I was reading a lot of Kelly Armstrong's books, but she was also very active in that forum herself, posting sort of advice and guidance and even sometimes giving feedback to people. And she would also post these short stories that were plugins to her wider universe. And at the time, that was something I'd never encountered before. So I'd never been sort of part of the fan fiction scene, and I still haven't really. But this was something different. It was like she was posting these add-on short stories that plugged into these novels that I was buying in Waterstones, and it was just, I could just download them for free on her website, and then we could talk about them, and I could talk about them to her. And it was it was a weird sort of feeling, and it was and I think that has very much rubbed off on me as the kind of writer that I want to be, is somebody who does that sort of exploring of the world around the core, so rather than just publishing the core series, does that sort of like filling in, adding extra bits and pieces in different formats and so on. That definitely was something I drew from her. So yes, that's probably be the two top of my list. I'm gonna leave it at that and move on, because I could talk about lots of authors and it would take us a long time. So I'm gonna carry on. So what else have we got on the list here? So Ruth asks, what are your thoughts on NaNoWriMo? I know some writers don't like it as it doesn't encourage consistency. Oh yeah, I am a shockingly bad NaNoWriMo writer. I have a lot of failed projects on NaNoWriMo. I have done it, and I have succeeded at it once or twice, but most of the time I will sort of like set up a project with all the best intentions and then fail miserably to actually keep up any kind of momentum. I don't know. I've kind of like come to the conclusion where it doesn't matter if I don't hit the deadline, the goal, so long as I've boosted my productivity over what I might have otherwise done. And that's a good sort of attitude that I take into it when I do it. I don't sign up to every event, but when I do sign up to it, I like the concept of it. The practicality of it doesn't necessarily suit my writing style all that well, and I'm sure that's the case for a lot of people. It's some people, it's absolutely the thing that they need is a almost like a gamification of it. It's that, fill in the chart, hit the deadline, get the reward, get the certificate. Actually, is the best possible motivation they could have to get their bum in their seat and to get their hands on their keyboard. And for them, I think it's fantastic. I think if you're not one of those people, there's a risk that it can be counterproductive, and that it will actually disencourage you, that you'll start and you won't keep up with the rate, and you'll see yourself falling behind, and that will get you so disheartened that it'll actually put you off writing entirely. And that's obviously not good. I think but I like to think that anybody who falls into that category can ultimately find a different relationship with it, where they either walk away from it completely and they just do their own thing, or if they do want to continue using it, that they find a more healthy way to engage with that sort of measure of success. So that's it's a complicated thing. I'm not very good at it, but I do enjoy taking part. It's a bit weird. So okay, next question. Rich asks, what do you think you have learned over the course of writing MIME? Now that's an interesting one, because my friend Pete Sutton did an author interview with me. And one of the questions he asked me was, "What did you learn by writing? What did you learn about writing by writing your book?" And my answer was just everything, because it has been my whole sort of training ground project. It was. I started writing when I was a teenager at school. My English teacher was actually very encouraging and really sort of like, I think, saw something in what I was doing that he wanted to encourage. And I think I have somewhere one of those little like yearbooks that you get people to sign at the end of school, and he actually wrote a comment in it that said, "Write it, finish it, publish it." And I wasn't at the time entirely sure what that meant, and then I think it was because he ultimately knew where my life was going before I did, so that was a bit weird. Because I didn't really do any writing from about the point that I left secondary school to the point that I had finished my first degree, and I was trying to decide what the hell to watch, until I started my second degree, because I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And that was a period of about 10 years. So he had the jump on me. I think he knew what I was all about right back then. But anyway, so MIME then was the first project where I decided to get back into writing. So I'm around about 26 years old, and we had been working on the short film Terror of the Killer Carnivorous Coat over our Easter bank holiday weekend, and we'd sort of discussed about sort of like expanding this universe into more media. So because we loved the idea at that point. This is around about 2009. So we loved the idea of this sort of emerging world of online storytelling, about how you can combine different things together. And I think also because Mark, who's the writer of the film, is a big Doctor Who fan, and the Doctor Who universe has always been one that is both sort of like television and books and comics. I think, he was one of those, it's one of those fandoms that was always quite ahead in this sort of multimedia idea. So anyway, we were talking about other mediums that we could start exploring with the Gabriel Cushing universe, and where was I going? So other mediums, and I that was where sort of like the idea, I said, I could write it as a novel, and thinking, 10 years ago I used to write stories, that would be cool, I could do this, it'd be easy. No, not so much. But anyway, that was around about 2009. And then it's taken me until now to get this book, my first book that I started writing in May of 2009, to the point where it's now in people's hands. And over the course of that 10 years, I have written, some even complete whole novels that are shockingly bad and still sitting in a drawer somewhere, lots of short stories and so on and so forth. But everything that I did and learned with those other projects, I put it into successful practice for the first time with this book. So in a way, it's taught me everything about how to write and complete and go through the process of writing a novel from start to finish, because it's the first time I have actually done it from start to finish. I've got a lot of partially completed projects. I've got a lot of short stories that I've gone through the process with, but this is the first novel. So I think the short answer is it's taught me everything about what I know about writing now. This has been my training ground, my apprenticeship project, I think. And I've learned a lot of things about, locations and people and things as well, because we researched stuff along the way. I couldn't really tell you what they are without thinking about them, but yeah, so that's that one. Okay, going to spin on now to Ruth's question, second question. How long has MIME taken you to complete from initial idea to publication? Well, I think I just answered that one. So it's just over 10 years. I have my hang on, fun little tidbit here. This is my notebook. This is my MIME notebook that I started, and this is page 1, and this is my first notes on who is Elliot, who is the protagonist, and that, as you can see, is dated 6th of the 5th 2009. So it's around about 11 years now since I wrote that, and now it's done. So yeah, I was not working on it solidly for that entire time. As I said, I started planning it around about that time, but I didn't know what I was doing. And then I kind of decided I needed to write a lot of other things in order to learn more about how to write, which is where I went away and wrote my other training ground project, which is a story called Hidden Talent, which in its current form will never see the light of day. It is shockingly bad, and that is after I rewrote it 3 times. So the good news is, though, that taught me so much about writing that I was then able to successfully put into practice writing MIME, so that was good. And then there was a couple of years in the middle when I was doing the filming for Carnival of Sorrows, around about 2013, 2014 time. I was also involved in a play in London. So that year, I did not get a lot done in terms of writing during that year. But then things sort of picked up a pace again afterwards, when I was sort of more solidly focused on just doing the writing. So I think really the main bulk of the pulling MIME into shape and getting it finished and rewritten and the beta feedback and so on and so forth was from about 2015 to about the end of 2019. So that was, so it was about four years of solid work on that particular project. So that one I think answers Ruth's question. And then Pete asks, will you ever try sci-fi? Do you prefer to write in third person? Okay, so sneaking 2 questions in at once there. I'm going to answer the second one first. Do I prefer to write in third person? Weirdly enough, writing in first person sometimes feels like a little bit of a cop-out to me. So I don't know why. It's particularly easy to get a deep point of view when you're writing in first person, because you're just in that person's head and you can just seamlessly move between thought and action and so on, but it also, for me, I think is almost too close sometimes. I think I like writing in third person, partially because I almost always write dual protagonists. I almost always write 2 characters, and I think flipping between the two when you're in first person, I'm not sure I'd be up to doing that full justice. I know I can get away with it and I can do it well in third. But that doesn't mean I don't write in first person. I do have other stories, short stories in particular, and some of my longer stuff which is written in first person, but mainly when it's only one point of view character. So that's that. Will I ever try sci-fi? I've written some sci-fi. I haven't written any novels that are... Well, actually, no, that's a complete lie. Hidden Talent is technically sci-fi, but it's near future sci-fi. So it's the notion of it is it's set about 50-60 years in the future, and it's slightly dystopian but not entirely, and has lots of future tech and stuff, but it's not spaceships. So in terms of sci-fi, I would probably write more sort of near future Earth-based sci-fi rather than space space opera kind of sci-fi or anything like that. But that said, I have written some short stories that are very much hard sci-fi. So I did a short which I did for a reading event for the Bristol Festival of Literature, not last year, year before, which was called The Space Between the Stars. I think it was The Space Between the Stars. Anyway, it's a story about a cryogenic like an ark ship, and a character in that who was sort of awake whilst being in suspended animation and was witness to a crime that happened when nobody else was there. So that's a short story that I did. I actually intend to do a video recording of that, so I will post that on my YouTube at some point. Right, so I think that brings us to the end of all the posted questions. Thank you guys, because that's kept us really busy, and we've now got about 10 minutes left, so that is cool. What I think I will do now is I will do another quick reading from the book, and then if Mark's just snuck in another question there. Okay, you're gonna have to wait, Mark. So I am gonna do a quick reading of I might only do the one this rather than 2. I'm gonna do the... Hang on, where's my page? Right, I'm going to do the beginning of chapter 5. So So anyway, so this is the chapter 1 that you heard earlier was from Elliot's point of view. This is actually a scene with Sam. So Sam is Elliot's colleague and employee, and she works for him as a sort of like an office assistant slash journalist slash photographer slash do everything else kind of person. And she is Elliot sent her off to investigate another incident that has happened actually prior to the incident that happens in chapter 1, and which is a shooting death, which they hadn't investigated previously because they didn't see any reason to it. It didn't seem like it was going to be a supernatural thing. But then out of the blue, the victim's mother contacts them and asks them to investigate because she thinks that something is amiss. Anyway, so Sam and Mrs. Perry, Joyce Perry, who is the victim's mother, are now taking a trip to the public mortuary to visit the body of the victim and to do a bit of hands-on investigation. So here we go. This is chapter 5. We need to be 100% sure of this, Sam. Sam climbed out of her car outside the public mortuary at Blacksborton. That means we may have to touch him. Joyce Perry looked at her across the bonnet. You'll be careful, though. Of course. Secretly, she'd hoped Joyce might do it for her. But this was one of those times when she needed to be the adult. She'd met Joyce in town outside the gallery's shopping centre, rather than picking her up from her home. Joyce was still hiding her activities from her husband. The woman's grey threaded hair had a dull greasiness to it, her skin blotchy and sallow. The loss of her son was taking its toll. The newly built facility stood across the car park from the historic coroner's court. They headed inside. The foyer didn't feel right. It still smelled of new carpet and fresh paint. Everything pristine. Maybe it needed time to settle into its identity, and in the future it would become infused with the subtle odours of death and embalming fluid. The freshly painted walls would take on a mildewed pallor peppered with yellow-brown flick stains that you hoped were coffee, but secretly feared were some unmentionable excretion. "Mrs. Perry?" said a male voice. Sam jumped, pulse spiking. She rubbed at an uncomfortable tingle on the back of her neck. "Right this way," the attendant said, with a sweeping gesture towards a door. Sam let Joyce go first. There were dead people on the other side of these walls. Sam had never seen a dead body. She'd seen pictures, sure, but she'd never been up close and personal with a real, freshly corpseified human wrapper. She wasn't entirely sure how she was going to react, and it made her itchy and uncomfortable in her own skin. She hunched her shoulders, skin prickling. The building presented a false sense of normalcy. She longed for the tatty, mouldy morgue of her imagination, where the deceased would not be so unexpected. The attendant led Sam and Joyce through a corridor to another door. The room beyond was dark, but a light flicked on as he entered, triggered by the movement, and he held the door for them. To the side of the room, laid out on a stainless steel trolley and covered with a crisp white sheet, lay the body of Alex Perry. A simple floral wreath propped up against the wall by his head gave a nod towards the humanity of the moment. Sam moved up closer to Joyce, and the older woman took her hand, squeezing tight like Sam was holding her up, or holding her together. Sam squeezed back as the tingle at the base of her skull intensified and jerked hard on a memory she tried to keep buried. She concentrated on keeping her breathing even against the sudden surge of adrenaline. Spirits maintained a link to their earthly remains. Sam knew that firsthand, and Alex's presence was heavy in the room, expectant. She should have anticipated that. The attendant crossed the room to the corpse and, at a nod from Joyce, turned down Alex's pale, blue-lipped face. His eyes were mercifully closed. "Could we have a moment alone?" Joyce asked. That was supposed to be Sam's line, and she realised she'd just been standing there doing nothing except trying to control the urge to bolt for the door instead of taking charge. The attendant nodded and stepped out. There were no sounds of footsteps in the corridor, so he was likely waiting just outside. They would have to be very careful. Sam took a moment to acclimatise. The itch creeping over her scalp hadn't progressed any further, and she tried to calm herself and tune the sensation out by studying the cold contrast of Alex's lifeless face, the utter stillness. Her hands instinctively went to where her camera would be, but she'd left it in the car. Memento Mori, photographs of the dead from Victorian times, had always held a chill fascination for her. Looking at Alex now, she understood why. No matter how they were posed or lit or made up, the dead never looked alive. They were altogether other. Joyce stifled a sob and wiped her eyes with her other hand. If Joyce could hold it together, then Sam could do what they'd come here to do. She released Joyce's hand, stepped up to Alex and took a deep breath. Slowly, she took hold of the sheet and drew it further down, revealing his neck, shoulders, the puckered, bloodless, Y-shaped incision across his chest, and one small hole an inch to the left of his breastbone. Sam felt tears threatening, but forced herself to focus on the mystery and not on the fact that Alex was no longer Alex, but a chilled meatbag because some evil thing had ripped through his vulnerable flesh and taken away what had made him Alex. She took a pair of latex gloves from her pocket and put them on, taking the time to steel herself for the next step. Then, gloved up, she put one hand on his shoulder and the other on his lower back. His arm brushed her sleeve and she tensed. Like an echo, a sensation of fingers on her skin slid up her neck and cheek. She shuddered. The feeling subsided and she breathed again. Carefully, she rolled Alex's body towards the wall and leaned down to peer underneath. A bullet exiting a body exploded out, ripping tissue as it went, leaving a ragged, mushy wound, far more gruesome than the neat, round entry wound like the one over Alex's heart. But there was nothing. The skin on his back was unbroken, unmarred, but for some red blotches like livid bruising. Sam pushed him further onto his side, checking in case the bullet had gone through at more of an angle than the entry wound suggested. Joyce wasn't mistaken. The bullet must still be inside. Or it had never existed in the first place. Like the animals that ripped up the girl at the market, or the flames that no one could agree were there or not when Sam Chaudhry burned to death. She settled Alex back down, quietly, carefully. Without saying a word, she replaced the sheet and removed her gloves. "I was right?" asked Joyce. "About the exit wound? Yes. But I'm not sure that points to a cover-up. I'm not sure what's going on. But we'll find out. I promise." There we go. So that was the beginning of chapter 5. So here we go. Right, so we have like 1 minute left on my scheduled hour. So I'm very quickly going to answer Mark's question of what's the difference between urban fantasy, dark fantasy, horror and thriller. I would say that they all overlap. It's like a weird Venn diagram of like smudginess and stuff. So I think each of those possibly has their own defining characteristics, but they also have a lot of crossover, so I think it's very difficult to say. I categorise MIME as being a supernatural thriller, partially because of the thriller aspect of that. So I saw a really good definition about what's the difference between crime, mystery and thriller. So the idea being that mystery tends to focus on the questions, but it leaves the antagonist and the perpetrator as sort of a bit of a mystery figure in the background. Crime focuses very much on the events that happen as opposed to the investigator. So the questions rather than the mystery is perhaps more strongly driven by the who is the investigator as well, but thriller has an element of threat, and that is where, and you often have to have face time between the protagonist and the antagonist in order for it to be a thriller as opposed to crime or mystery. So and that was how I sort of settled on the idea that that's what MIME is. It's sort of, it is ostensibly a thriller, as a so it has mystery elements, but it also has that threat element and so on. And then of course also it is obviously also urban fantasy or also supernatural. There's a lot of debate over what constitutes urban fantasy. There's an urban fantasy group that I'm a member of where nobody can decide the answer to that. So, and then horror. I think horror is a feeling. I think horror is a tone, and that's one of the reasons why I don't necessarily call MIME horror, because for me it doesn't have the right tone to be primarily classed as horror, but it has horror elements. So there we go. That's my quick answer to the last question there. So I think we will wrap up there because we are now just about running over. Thank you everybody so much for tuning in and for doing this with me. It's been really nice actually. I was terrified that I was gonna start the stream and there was going to be nobody here and nobody's going to ask any questions. But you've all done like a brilliant job of asking the questions and giving me something to talk about. So thank you ever so much. And I'm going to sign off now and wish you all a lovely evening. And I hope you'll sort of, if you haven't already read the book, that you will read the book. And if you do, consider posting a review because reviews are really cool and they do a lot sort of like to help sort of like help the author and to help sort of like the profile of the book. So and they're sort of like, so they're kind of like magic gold dust in that way. So anyway, have a lovely evening everybody. I'm going to sign off now. Take care and bye bye from me.